My new VP, Jeremiah Lee, fired me at 4 a.m. on the loading dock because he claimed lady truckers are slow. He didn't care that my rig was loaded with $3 million of highly volatile chemicals. So I walked away, let his unqualified rookie take the keys, and made a single phone call to a federal inspector that would cost Jeremiah his career, his fortune, and his freedom. The crisp night air at the terminal always smelled like diesel fuel and damp asphalt. At exactly 3:45 a.m., I was doing my pre-trip inspection on Unit 409, a massive Peterbilt hauling a specialized reinforced tanker. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the bold red and white Hazmat placards locked into place on the trailer's aluminum siding. Inside that tanker sat $3 million worth of reactive industrial chemical compounds destined for apex chemical industries. I had been driving for nearly 2 decades. My safety record was spotless. In my mid-40s, I knew every bolt and valve on this rig better than I knew my own living room. Footsteps crunched against the gravel. I slid out from under the chassis, wiping a smudge of grease from my heavy canvas jacket, and stood up to find Jeremiah Lee marching toward me. Jeremiah was our newly appointed vice president of regional freight operations. He was a man who clearly believed he was the smartest person in any zip code. Even at 4 in the morning, he was wearing a tailored Italian wool suit that cost more than I made in 3 months, paired with polished leather loafers that had no business being on a greasy loading dock. Trailing behind him like a nervous shadow was Cora Allen, the director of terminal operations, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield. "Brenda Taylor," Jeremiah announced, his voice slicing through the low hum of idling engines across the yard. He didn't bother saying hello. He just stared at me with cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Lee," I replied, keeping my tone even as I clicked my flashlight off. "Cora, what brings management down to the asphalt before the sun is even thinking about coming up?" Jeremiah scoffed, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "I'm streamlining this division, Brenda. We have new efficiency metrics to meet. You've been running this premium route for 5 years, pulling top-tier mileage pay. But the numbers don't lie. Your average transit times are lagging behind my projected optimization models." I raised an eyebrow. "My transit times are dictated by federal safety regulations for hauling Class 3 flammable liquids. Jeremiah, I don't speed. I don't skip mandatory rest periods. That's why this company pays lower insurance premiums on my rig than any other truck in the fleet." He waved a manicured hand in the air, dismissing my 2 decades of flawless logistics experience. "Excuses. The reality is lady truckers are slow. You're too cautious, too set in the old ways. I need aggressive drivers who can push the envelope and turn these shipments around faster. I've reviewed the roster, and frankly, you are an unnecessary expense. We are terminating your contract, effective immediately." The terminal suddenly felt unnaturally quiet. Cora stared at her shoes, refusing to meet my gaze. "Cora," I said calmly, "is this true? You're signing off on an immediate termination without cause." "It's an at-will state, Brenda," Cora mumbled quietly, her voice trembling. "Jeremiah has full authority over route assignments and fleet personnel." I looked back at Jeremiah. He was smirking, radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who loved exercising his power over people he considered beneath him. He held out his hand. "Give me the keys, Brenda. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your home address by the end of the week. Please gather your personal belongings from the cab and vacate company property. I have a new driver ready to take over this route right now." I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just looked at the massive steel tanker behind me, then back at Jeremiah's arrogant face. He had no idea what he had just done. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key ring, and dropped it right into his soft, uncalloused palm. "Good luck, Jeremiah," I said. I turned my back on Jeremiah Lee and climbed up the metal steps into the cab of Unit 409 one last time. The interior was my sanctuary. I had a small framed photo of my golden retriever taped to the dashboard, a customized orthopedic seat cushion I'd bought myself, and a stack of highly specific emergency response manuals tucked into the side pocket. I grabbed my worn duffel bag from the sleeper berth and began methodically tossing my belongings inside. I wasn't rushing. Let them wait. Let Jeremiah stand out there in the cold morning air in his ridiculous suit. Through the driver's side window, I watched another figure approach the truck. It was Luis Ramirez. Luis was a good kid, maybe 22 years old, but he was completely green. He had only earned his commercial driver's license 6 weeks ago and had spent the last month doing local dry van runs, hauling toilet paper and pallets of bottled water. He looked terrified. His oversized safety vest practically swallowed him whole, and his hard hat sat slightly crooked on his head. "All right, Ramirez," Jeremiah barked, tossing the heavy ring of keys at the young man. Luis fumbled, nearly dropping them into a puddle of oily water. "This is your rig now. Hook up the airlines, finish whatever inspection she was dragging her feet on, and get this shipment on the highway. I want this delivery at the Apex Chemical Plant by noon. No excuses." I zipped up my duffel bag and climbed down from the cab. As my boots hit the pavement, I locked eyes with Luis. His hands were shaking as he gripped the keys. "Miss Brenda," Luis stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward Jeremiah before looking back at me. I didn't know they were giving me your truck. I've never driven a liquid tanker before. The slosh. They said it handles different." "It does handle differently, Luis," I said gently, completely ignoring Jeremiah's impatient sighs. "When you have 30,000 gallons of liquid shifting behind you, a hard brake will push you right through an intersection. You have to anticipate every stop a quarter mile in advance." "Enough of the driving lesson," Jeremiah snapped, stepping between us. "Ramirez, get in the truck. Taylor, I told you to vacate the premises. You are trespassing." From across the yard, Big Joe Higgins stepped out of the shadows. Joe was a massive man with a thick gray beard and arms like tree trunks. He had been driving for the company since I was in high school. He didn't say a word, but he crossed his arms and glared at Jeremiah, his silent presence offering a wall of solidarity. Jeremiah nervously adjusted his collar but stood his ground. I slung the duffel bag over my shoulder and took a slow, deliberate look at the side of the trailer. Right there, practically glowing under the terminal's security floodlights, were the distinctive, diamond-shaped hazardous materials placards. They indicated Class 3 flammable liquids and Class 8 corrosives. I knew exactly what was in those tanks. I knew the specific chemical volatility. More importantly, I knew the strict federal regulations governing who was legally allowed to turn the ignition key of a truck hauling them. I looked at Luis, who was staring blankly at the complex array of specialized air valves on the trailer's bulkhead. He had no idea what he was looking at. "Luis," I asked casually, keeping my voice low, "did you finish your advanced endorsement testing yet?" Luis shook his head, looking completely overwhelmed. "No, ma'am. I only have my basic Class A. Mr. Lee said I didn't need anything else for a regional run." A cold, sharp smile formed on my lips. I didn't say another word to either of them. I turned around, gave a brief nod to Big Joe, and began the long walk across the gravel lot toward my personal vehicle. Jeremiah Lee had just handed the keys of a rolling bomb to an unendorsed driver. I tossed my duffel bag into the passenger seat of my old Subaru Outback, started the engine, and pulled out of the terminal gates just as the digital clock on the dashboard clicked to 4:18 a.m. The streets were completely deserted. The world was still asleep, unaware of the massive regulatory disaster brewing on the loading dock I had just left. I didn't drive home. Instead, I headed straight for a 24-hour diner situated 2 exits down the interstate. I needed coffee, and I needed a quiet booth to calculate exactly how deep of a grave Jeremiah Lee had just dug for himself. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and fried bacon. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth near the back window, ordered a large black coffee from a waitress who looked just as tired as I felt, and pulled my tablet out of my bag. Outside the window, the neon sign buzzed a steady, rhythmic hum. I opened a blank document and started listing the facts. Fact 1. The shipment secured to Unit 409 was a proprietary chemical compound manufactured exclusively for Apex Chemical Industries. It was highly corrosive and incredibly unstable if not transported under precise, temperature-controlled conditions. Fact 2. The Department of Transportation mandates that any driver hauling this specific classification of materials must possess an active, federally verified hazardous materials Hazmat endorsement on their commercial license, alongside a specialized tanker endorsement. Fact 3. Luis Ramirez possessed neither of those things. Jeremiah Lee's obsession with cost-cutting and his arrogant disdain for slow lady truckers had blinded him to the basic legal requirements of the logistics industry. By firing me and forcing an unendorsed rookie to take that load, Jeremiah hadn't just made a poor managerial decision, he had committed a severe federal violation. The DOT doesn't issue warnings for hazmat violations of this magnitude. They issue crippling fines, they impound equipment, and they revoke operating authorities. I took a sip of the scalding black coffee and let the warmth spread through my chest. My hands weren't shaking from anger, they were perfectly steady. Over my 20 years in the industry, I had seen arrogant executives come and go. They always thought they could outsmart the system, cut corners, and squeeze the working class to pad their own bonuses. But Jeremiah had crossed a line that you simply do not cross. This wasn't just about my job anymore. This was about a $3 million rolling environmental hazard being placed in the hands of a terrified kid, because a man in an expensive suit wanted to prove a point. I tapped my fingers against the laminate table. The shipment was highly time-sensitive. Leonardo Young, the CEO of Apex Chemical, was known to be a ruthless businessman who did not tolerate delays. If that chemical compound didn't arrive by noon, an entire manufacturing line would shut down, costing Apex hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket and scrolled through my contacts. I bypassed family, I bypassed friends, and I stopped at a number I hadn't dialed in nearly 3 years. The contact name simply read, Micah Harris. Years ago, Micah and I worked at a different logistics firm. When a dispatch error nearly cost Micah his job during a massive federal audit, I stepped up, took the heat, and provided the documentation that proved his innocence. I saved his career, and he never forgot it. Micah was no longer a low-level desk jockey. He was now a senior federal compliance investigator for the Department of Transportation. He was the man you called when an entire company needed to be dismantled piece by legal piece. I looked at the clock. It was 4:45 a.m. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. It was time to wake the federal government up. The phone rang 3 times before a groggy, deep voice answered on the other end. At 4:46 a.m., most normal people were fast asleep, wrapped warmly in their blankets. Micah Harris was one of those people, but he knew better than to ignore a call from my number. Brenda, Micah's voice was thick with sleep, accompanied by the rustling of sheets in the background. It's before dawn on a Tuesday. Tell me your rig isn't upside down in a ditch somewhere. My rig is perfectly fine, Micah, I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm, though my heart was beating a steady, focused rhythm against my ribs. In fact, it's sitting on the terminal asphalt, but I'm not in the driver's seat. I'm sitting in a vinyl booth at a diner off exit 12, drinking terrible coffee. There was a long pause on the line. The rustling stopped. You're not driving? Brenda, you've run that Apex Chemical dedicated lane for 5 years. Did you retire without telling me? I was fired, I stated flatly. I took a sip from the heavy ceramic mug, watching the neon diner sign flicker through the fogged glass of the window. Jeremiah Lee, the new regional VP of Freight Operations, decided that my safety-first approach was negatively impacting his optimization metrics. He specifically told me that lady truckers are slow, demanded my keys, and ordered me off the property. Micah let out a low whistle. That's a wrongful termination lawsuit waiting to happen. You have a flawless jacket. But Brenda, You didn't wake a federal inspector up before the sun to talk about HR disputes. What's the real emergency? The emergency, Micah, is who he handed my keys to, I said, leaning closer to the phone. My trailer is loaded with 30,000 gallons of proprietary, Class 3 flammable and Class 8 corrosive compounds bound for Apex Chemical Industries. It's a $3 million payload. Jeremiah handed those keys to a 22-year-old rookie named Luis Ramirez. Luis only has a basic Class A commercial license, no tanker endorsement, and absolutely no federal Hazmat endorsement. The silence that followed was heavy. When Micah finally spoke, all the sleep was gone from his voice. He was entirely in his element now, a senior federal compliance investigator for the Department of Transportation facing a massive, blatant violation. An unendorsed driver hauling a full Class 3 reactive payload? Micah asked, his tone sharp and clinical. That's not just a fine, Brenda. That's a catastrophic public safety hazard. If that kid hits the brakes too hard, the liquid surge alone will push him through an intersection and flip that trailer. He doesn't know how to handle the slosh. I know, I replied. And Jeremiah forced him into the cab under threat of firing him, too. The kid was terrified. They are pushing him to make the noon delivery deadline for Leonardo Young at Apex. Leonardo Young? Micah muttered, the sound of a laptop booting up echoing through the receiver. Young is a shark. He holds government defense contracts. If that raw material doesn't arrive safely, it breaches federal manufacturing timelines. Jeremiah Lee just lit a match in a powder keg. You remember that time in 2014, Micah? I asked softly, watching the diner waitress wipe down the counter. When that massive paperwork discrepancy almost cost you your federal clearance, and I spent 3 days digging through archived dispatch logs to prove it was a system error, not your mistake. I remember, Micah said, his voice softening with genuine gratitude. I owe you my career, Brenda. I told you I'd pay that life debt whenever you called it in. I'm calling it in, I said. Unit 409 is about to hit Interstate 95 North. It's a rolling bomb driven by a terrified kid because an arrogant executive wanted to save a few pennies. Do your job, Micah. Pull them over. Consider the trap set, Micah promised. Stay safe, Brenda. By 5:30 a.m., the sun was just beginning to turn the eastern horizon a bruised, dark purple. I had left the diner and returned to my Subaru Outback, parked under a flickering streetlight at the far edge of the lot. The heater blew dry, warm air against my face as I opened my heavy company-issued tablet. Jeremiah Lee was a man obsessed with efficiency, but he clearly knew nothing about the IT department's actual turnaround times. When an employee was fired, their digital credentials were supposed to be revoked immediately. But at 5 in the morning, the system administrators were fast asleep. My login for the company's fleet tracking software still worked perfectly. I typed in my password, and the screen illuminated the dark cabin of my car with a pale blue glow. A digital map of the state appeared, dotted with little green truck icons. I typed Unit 409 into the search bar. The screen zoomed in, centering on a blinking red dot moving slowly along the access road leading to Interstate 95. Luis was driving, but looking at the telemetry data flashing on the right side of my screen, my stomach tied into a tight knot. His speed was fluctuating wildly, accelerating to 45 miles per hour, then violently braking down to 20. He was experiencing the liquid surge. When you haul 30,000 gallons of liquid in a smoothbore tank, the liquid doesn't just sit still. When you brake, the heavy chemical compound rushes forward like a tidal wave, slamming against the front bulkhead of the trailer and physically shoving the entire truck forward. If you don't know how to feather the brakes and anticipate the wave, it feels like a giant is kicking the back of your cab. The kid was fighting the truck, and the truck was winning. My cell phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text message from Big Joe Higgins, my veteran friend from the terminal yard. Joe, kid hit a concrete barrier on the way out of the gate, scraped the bumper. He's shaking like a leaf. Jeremiah is pacing the dock, screaming at Cora about the delay. I typed back quickly, "Stay out of the blast zone, Joe. It's about to get much worse." I looked back at the tablet. Micah Harris didn't just enforce regulations, he orchestrated compliance traps with the precision of a military general. 10 miles up the interstate from Lewis's current location was the southbound way station at mile marker 42. Normally, at this hour on a Tuesday, the scales were closed, the lights off, and trucks rolled right past. But as I watched the digital map, I noticed something remarkable. The dot traffic cameras, accessible through a public portal I had bookmarked, showed the way station suddenly springing to life. Bright halogen floodlights snapped on, illuminating the concrete scales. 3 dark SUV interceptors with federal plates pulled out from the back lot, taking up positions near the off-ramp. Micah had mobilized a full inspection team in less than 40 minutes. They weren't just going to pull Lewis over, they were setting up a mandatory, unavoidable funnel. When the way station lights are flashing, every commercial vehicle is legally required to pull in. Lewis was crawling up the highway, terrified of the cargo behind him, completely unaware that he was driving straight into a federal blockade. And back at the terminal, Jeremiah Lee was likely sipping premium coffee, fully believing he had successfully asserted his dominance over a slow, veteran driver. He had no idea the empire he thought he controlled was about to crumble under the weight of a federal badge. At exactly 6:15 a.m., the silence inside my Subaru was shattered by the vibrating buzz of my cell phone against the passenger seat. The cold morning light was finally creeping across the dashboard, revealing the dust motes dancing in the air. I glanced down at the caller ID. It read, "Terminal dispatch urgent." I let it ring 4 times before I calmly swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I answered, my voice deliberately flat and professional. "Brenda, oh thank God you pie." "Seek head up," a panicked voice spilled through the speaker. It was Cora Allen, the director of terminal operations. The spineless HR representative who had stared at her shoes just 2 hours ago while Jeremiah fired me was now hyperventilating. "Good morning, Cora," I replied, tracing a finger over the steering wheel. "I'm surprised to hear from you. Jeremiah made it very clear that my presence was no longer required, and I believe my final paycheck is already being processed." "Brenda, please listen to me," Cora begged, her voice high-pitched and frantic. In the background, I could hear the distinct, muffled sounds of Jeremiah Lee shouting obscenities at someone in his office. "We have a massive situation. Lewis missed the highway on-ramp. He panicked when the trailer surged at a stoplight, and he turned down a residential access road. He's stuck." I looked at my tablet. Sure enough, the blinking red dot of Unit 409 had deviated from the main highway and was currently sitting stationary in what looked like a narrow cul-de-sac. "Stuck?" I asked innocently. "What do you mean stuck?" "He can't back the trailer up, Brenda," Cora cried out. "The street is too narrow, and he's terrified of jackknifing the rig into a row of parked cars. He's locked himself in the cab, and he is refusing to put the truck in gear." The client, Leonardo Young at Apex Chemical, just called Jeremiah. Young's production floor is expecting that raw material by noon to begin mixing for a government contract. If they don't get it, we face a breach of contract penalty of $50,000 an hour. "That sounds like a severe logistical failure, Cora," I said smoothly. "Jeremiah wanted a driver who wouldn't drag their feet. It sounds like he found one who won't move his feet at all." "Brenda, stop playing games," Cora pleaded. "Jeremiah is willing to reinstate you. Right now, I have the paperwork on my desk. We will authorize a company vehicle to drive you to Lewis's location. You can take the wheel, get the truck out of the neighborhood, and deliver the load to Apex. We'll even give you a $5,000 bonus for the inconvenience." I leaned back in my seat and smiled at the windshield. The sheer arrogance of it all was almost poetic. They break federal law, endanger a neighborhood with a volatile payload, and then try to buy their way out of the consequences with a pathetic bonus. "Cora, let me explain something to you very clearly," I said, dropping the casual tone. My voice became cold steel. I am not an employee of your logistics firm. I am a private citizen. I am not legally authorized to operate your equipment anymore. Furthermore, you dispatched an unendorsed rookie to haul Class 3 and Class 8 hazardous materials. That is a massive federal violation. We can fix the paperwork later, Cora hissed, desperate. Just get in the truck. There is no later, Cora, I replied, watching the digital map on my tablet. The dot representing Lewis was suddenly surrounded by 3 new, distinct markers moving rapidly toward his location. Micah's interceptors hadn't waited for him at the scales. They had tracked the unauthorized route deviation. You and Jeremiah didn't just fire a driver today. You handed a rolling bomb to a child. Look out your office window, Cora. The consequences aren't coming later. They are already here. I pressed the red button to end the call, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. Jeremiah's desperate attempt to cover his tracks had failed. The federal lights were about to start flashing. At 6:45 a.m., the harsh morning sunlight had fully breached the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The interior of my Subaru was finally warm, the heater fan humming a steady, comforting tune. I was still watching the blinking icons on my company-issued tablet when a completely different device demanded my attention. My personal cell phone, resting in the center console, began to ring with an urgent, heavy vibration. I glanced down at the bright screen. The caller ID displayed a sharp, imposing name, Leonardo Young. Leonardo was the chief executive officer of Apex Chemical Industries. Over the last 5 years, I had hauled hundreds of loads directly to his specialized receiving facilities. He was a man of terrifying precision, known for his bespoke suits, his razor-sharp intellect, and his absolute zero-tolerance policy for logistical failures. He rarely dealt with freight dispatchers, preferring direct communication with the senior drivers who handled his multi-million-dollar assets. I picked up the phone, swiping the screen to accept the call. Brenda, Leonardo's voice was clipped, carrying the distinct metallic echo of a hands-free system inside a luxury vehicle. It is 45 minutes past 6 in the morning. My receiving foreman just informed me that Unit 409 has not cleared the interstate way stations. I am currently staring at a production schedule T. HAT requires 30,000 gallons of proprietary reactive polymers by noon. Where is my freight? Good morning, Mr. Young, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and deliberately calm, a stark contrast to his rising tension. Your freight is currently parked in a narrow residential cul-de-sac, completely immobilized. However, I am not the person you should be asking. I am sitting in my personal vehicle, drinking coffee. There was a profound, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The ambient road noise from his end seemed to amplify. You are not in the driver's seat? He asked, his tone dropping an octave into something dangerous and cold. Brenda, you are the only operator in that regional fleet with the specialized hazmat clearances required to transport this specific chemical compound. Explain yourself. Immediately. At 3:45 a.m. today, Jeremiah Lee, the new vice president of regional freight operations, terminated my contract on the loading dock. I explained systematically, leaving no room for emotion. He stated that my meticulous adherence to federal safety protocols was negatively impacting his delivery metrics. He explicitly told me that lady truckers are slow and demanded my keys. He then handed those keys to a 22-year-old rookie driver named Luis Ramirez. A rookie, Leonardo repeated, the word dripping with sudden, unbridled fury. Does this driver have the necessary Class 3 and Class 8 federal endorsements to handle a highly reactive, temperature-sensitive payload? He has a basic commercial license, Mr. Young. He has 0 hazardous materials training. He experienced liquid surge near a stoplight, panicked, and deviated into a residential neighborhood. He is currently trapped there, refusing to move the vehicle. Furthermore, the Department of Transportation is already actively intercepting the truck. They do not look kindly upon unendorsed drivers hauling $3 million rolling bombs. I heard the sound of screeching tires through the speaker, followed by the heavy, aggressive blare of a car horn as Leonardo clearly ordered his driver to change directions. "Brenda, this isn't just a standard chemical delivery," Leonardo said, his voice now vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. "That polymer is the foundational raw material for a highly classified, time-sensitive government aerospace defense contract. If that production line stops at noon, my company incurs catastrophic federal penalties, and I lose my security clearance. Jeremiah Lee has not just inconvenienced my supply chain, he has breached a federal manufacturing agreement." "I am well aware of the stakes, Mr. Young," I said softly. "That is why I refuse to hand the keys over without a witness." "I am redirecting my vehicle to your logistics terminal right now," Leonardo stated, his voice like cracking ice. "Jeremiah Lee is about to learn a very painful lesson about the cost of arrogance. Do not leave the area, Brenda. I am going to need you." The line went dead. Jeremiah Lee was a snake, and in my 20 years of navigating corporate logistics, I had learned that snakes always look for the easiest way to slither out of a trap. The moment the federal inspectors impounded that truck, Jeremiah would go into a frantic mode of self-preservation. He would undoubtedly attempt to alter the company records. He would blame the rookie driver for stealing the truck, or he would blame a glitch in the dispatch software, claiming he never officially authorized Luis Ramirez to take the hazmat load. I needed to sever his escape routes before he even realized he was trapped. I reached over, grabbed my tablet, and woke the screen back up. My administrative login credentials for the company's internal network, FleetLink Pro, were miraculously still active. Cora Allen was clearly too busy having a nervous breakdown in the HR office to process my termination paperwork in the IT portal. I connected my tablet to my phone's secure mobile hotspot and navigated to the encrypted dispatch manifesting system. The interface was a clunky, outdated gray dashboard that I had spent years learning to navigate perfectly. I clicked on the tab labeled Active Route Assignments and typed Unit 409 into the search parameter bar. The digital manifest loaded on my screen, displaying the complete logistical history of the shipment. There it was. At 3:55 a.m., the system showed a driver change. The assigned operator had been switched from Brenda Taylor to Luis Ramirez. However, right below the name change, a bright red flashing warning banner dominated the screen. "Critical error, driver ID 88492 lacks mandatory HAZMAT endorsement. Dispatch blocked." The software had done exactly what it was programmed to do. It had recognized that Luis was legally unqualified to haul the chemical payload and had engaged an automatic digital lockdown, preventing the printing of the necessary shipping manifests. Luis should never have been allowed to leave the terminal yard. But Jeremiah was impatient. I scrolled down to the bottom of the digital log, looking for the specific command string that had forced the system to generate the paperwork anyway. My eyes locked onto a small, damning line of green text buried in the system audit trail. AM System Lockdown OVERRIDDEN. Authorization Code. JLEVP99 A Executive Manual Override initiated. I let out a slow, satisfied breath. There it was, the absolute, undeniable proof of extreme gross negligence. Jeremiah hadn't just made a verbal mistake on the loading dock. He had intentionally logged into the federal compliance system, acknowledged the critical safety warning regarding the hazardous materials, and deliberately typed his unique executive password to bypass the safety protocols. He had left a glowing, neon digital fingerprint right on the murder weapon of his own career. I didn't waste a single second. I opened the file menu and selected Export Complete Audit Trail. I downloaded the uneditable, time-stamped PDF document directly to my tablet's local hard drive. Then, I opened my personal email application. I composed a new message, attaching the damning PDF file. In the recipient line, I typed in 2 email addresses. The first belonged to Micah Harris, the senior federal compliance investigator for the DOT, who was currently surrounding the stranded truck. The second address belonged to Leonardo Young, the furious CEO of Apex Chemical Industries, who was currently speeding toward the terminal. In the subject line, I simply wrote, Unit 409, Executive Override Evidence, J. Lee. I tapped the send button and watched the little blue bar slide across the screen until the message disappeared into the digital ether. The snare wasn't just pulled tight anymore, it was securely locked. Jeremiah Lee had built his entire career on the arrogant belief that he could control the numbers, manipulate the people beneath him, and cut corners without consequence. He was about to find out that the paper trail is utterly unforgiving. I put my Subaru in gear, turned out of the diner parking lot, and navigated the 2 miles back toward the industrial park. I didn't drive through the main security gates of the logistics terminal. Instead, I parked my car on the shoulder of the public access road, directly across from the massive chain-link fence that bordered the primary loading docks. Through the thick morning fog that was just beginning to burn off the asphalt, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the yard, where Jeremiah had fired me just 3 hours prior. I rolled my window down, letting the sharp scent of diesel fumes and wet gravel fill the cabin. My phone buzzed in my lap. It was another text from Big Joe Higgins, who was apparently enjoying a front-row seat to the unfolding chaos from the cab of his own parked rig. Joe, Jeremiah is melting down. He's pacing the dock, screaming into his cell phone. Cora is literally hiding in the break room. The yard is locked down. I smiled, typing a quick reply. Get your popcorn, Joe. The main event is arriving. No sooner had I hit send than the deep, commanding roar of a high-performance engine echoed down the access road. A sleek, midnight black Mercedes-Benz S-Class sedan turned sharply off the main street, its tires throwing up loose gravel as it completely bypassed the security checkpoint and drove straight into the active terminal yard. The luxury vehicle looked entirely out of place amidst the grease-stained concrete and towering aluminum trailers. It glided aggressively toward the main dispatch office and slammed on its brakes right at the edge of the loading dock. Before the car had even fully settled on its suspension, the rear door swung open. Leonardo Young stepped out into the cold morning air. He was a force of nature, impeccably dressed in a dark charcoal suit, his face set in a mask of absolute, terrifying rage. He didn't walk. He marched up the metal steps of the loading dock, heading straight for Jeremiah Lee, who had frozen mid-stride, his cell phone still pressed to his ear. Even from 100 yards away, I could see the exact moment the blood drained from Jeremiah's face. The arrogant swagger, the dismissive posture, it all vanished instantly. He fumbled his phone, shoving it into his pocket as he took a nervous step backward, raising his hands defensively as the CEO of his largest client approached him. But the trap wasn't fully sprung yet. A heavy, low rumbling sound began to shake the ground beneath my car. I looked down the access road to my left. Turning the corner was a massive, heavy-duty federal dot wrecker. Its yellow caution lights were spinning wildly, cutting through the morning haze. Behind the massive tow truck, securely chained to the hydraulic lift, was Unit 409. The silver, reinforced hazardous materials tanker gleamed under the rising sun, the Class 3 flammable placards clearly visible. Following closely behind the impounded truck was a fleet of 3 black, unmarked federal SUVs with hidden red and blue lights flashing fiercely in their grills. The entire convoy turned into the terminal yard, completely surrounding the loading dock, their tires crunching loudly against the gravel. The heavy wrecker engaged its air brakes, letting out a massive, hissing sigh that echoed across the silent yard. The doors of the lead federal SUV opened, and Micah Harris stepped out. He was wearing a dark tactical jacket with Federal Inspector printed across the back in bold, reflective yellow lettering. He adjusted his aviator sunglasses, holding a thick metal clipboard in his hand. Jeremiah Lee was trapped. To his left stood Leonardo Young, a furious billionaire ready to destroy his logistics contract. To his right stood Micah Harris, a federal agent holding irrefutable proof of a massive criminal safety violation. And directly in front of him was the $3 million chemical shipment he had so recklessly gambled with, now securely in the hands of the United States government. I leaned back against my orthopedic car seat, took a slow sip of my lukewarm diner coffee, and watched the arrogant empire finally begin to crumble. At exactly 7:05 a.m., I decided my front row seat inside my Subaru was a little too far from the main event. I zipped up my heavy canvas jacket, locked my car doors, and walked across the damp asphalt of the public access road. The red and blue LED strobes from Micah Harris's Federal Interceptor SUVs painted the gray concrete of the terminal yard in aggressive, rhythmic flashes. The morning air smelled sharply of diesel exhaust from the idling heavy-duty wrecker, and the faint, metallic scent of dew evaporating off the chain-link perimeter fence. I walked straight through the pedestrian gate. No security guard stopped me. They were all standing outside their booths, staring in absolute, stunned silence at the loading dock. Jeremiah Lee was visibly trembling. The perfectly tailored Italian wool suit he had worn like a suit of armor just 3 hours earlier now looked rumpled and entirely out of place. He was backed against the corrugated metal siding of the dispatch office, trapped between the furious billionaire CEO of his largest client and a senior federal compliance investigator. "Mr. Young," Jeremiah stammered, holding his hands up defensively as Leonardo stepped onto the dock. "Leonardo, please, there has been a massive misunderstanding. A rogue driver took the Hazmat unit without proper dispatch clearance. We are actively mitigating the situation." "Do not insult my intelligence, Jeremiah," Leonardo Young interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying baritone that echoed off the aluminum trailers parked nearby. "My raw materials are currently chained to a dot wrecker because you fired my most reliable transport specialist at 4 in the morning." Micah Harris stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots thudding against the concrete stairs. He didn't look angry, he looked entirely clinical, which was somehow much worse. He held his thick metal clipboard in his left hand and a federal-issue tablet in his right. "Jeremiah Lee?" Micah asked, his voice projecting the undeniable authority of the federal government. "I am Senior Investigator Harris with the Department of Transportation. I am officially impounding Unit 409 under Section 392 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. You dispatched an unendorsed operator to transport 30,000 gallons of Class 3 and Class 8 hazardous materials. That operator subsequently deviated from the approved routing and abandoned the payload in a civilian residential zone." "I didn't authorize him," Jeremiah shrieked, his voice cracking as panic finally shattered his arrogant facade. "The kid stole the truck. He bypassed the terminal gate. I never signed off on his digital manifest." I stopped walking, standing just at the edge of the loading dock stairs. I crossed my arms and offered Jeremiah a small, cold smile. He noticed me, and his eyes widened in sudden, horrifying realization. "Actually, Jeremiah," Micah said smoothly, tapping the screen of his tablet, "that is a direct lie to a federal agent. We have already pulled the digital audit trail from your FleetLink Pro system. At exactly 4:02 a.m., the automated safety software blocked the dispatch of Unit 409 because driver ID 88492 lacked a Hazmat endorsement. 10 seconds later, an executive manual override was initiated." Micah turned the tablet around so Jeremiah could see the glowing screen. Even from the bottom of the stairs, I knew exactly what it said. "Authorization code JLEEVP99A," Micah read aloud, enunciating every single syllable. "You deliberately bypassed the safety protocols of a federally regulated chemical transport. You didn't just break company policy, Mr. Lee. You committed federal logistics fraud, reckless endangerment of a civilian populace, and violation of Homeland Security trans. Port statutes." Cora Allen, the spineless director of terminal operations, burst out of the break room doors behind Jeremiah, sobbing hysterically and clutching a cardboard box of her personal belongings. She had already seen the writing on the wall. Jeremiah looked at the tablet, looked at the furious billionaire standing inches from him, and finally looked down at me. The smug, dismissive man who had told me lady truckers are slow was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified executive, realizing that his empire had just evaporated. By 7:30 a.m., the terminal yard had transformed from a busy logistics hub into an active federal crime scene. 2 local state police cruisers had arrived to provide backup for Micah's team, parking horizontally across the main exit gates to ensure no one left the premises. The heavy morning fog had completely lifted, replacing the damp chill with the harsh, unforgiving light of a clear Tuesday morning. Every single employee on the dock, from the forklift operators to the senior dispatchers, had stopped working to watch the spectacular implosion of their newly appointed vice president. Leonardo Young adjusted the cuffs of his dark charcoal suit, his expression as hard and unyielding as granite. He stepped closer to Jeremiah, invading his personal space with a menacing, calculated calm. "Let me explain the exact magnitude of your incompetence, Jeremiah," Leonardo said, his voice carrying easily over the low hum of the idling police cruisers. "That chemical compound in Unit 409 is not just an industrial cleaner. It is a highly proprietary, temperature-sensitive polymer required for an active Department of Defense aerospace contract. Because of your catastrophic failure to deliver this raw material by my noon deadline, my production floor will immediately halt." Jeremiah's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He was sweating profusely, beads of moisture rolling down his forehead and soaking into his expensive silk collar. We can expedite another truck," he whispered weakly. "You will do no such thing," Leonardo snapped. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. Effective as of 7:32 a.m., Apex Chemical Industries is exercising the breach of contract penalty clause embedded in our logistics agreement. I am officially terminating our 5-year, $30 million regional transport contract with your firm. You are no longer authorized to haul my freight." Jeremiah staggered backward until his shoulders hit the corrugated metal wall. Losing the Apex account meant the instant financial ruin of the entire regional branch. He had tried to save a few pennies by firing a veteran driver, and it had just cost his company $30 million. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. Micah Harris stepped forward, gesturing to the 2 state troopers waiting at the bottom of the dock stairs. "Jeremiah Lee," Micah said, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "Based on the digital evidence of your executive override and the reckless endangerment caused by your direct orders, you are being placed under federal detainment pending a full criminal investigation by the Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency." "You can't arrest me," Jeremiah yelled, his voice echoing shrilly across the silent yard. "I'm a vice president. I have lawyers. It was a clerical error." "A clerical error doesn't manually type an override password into a federal database, Mr. Lee," Micah replied coldly. The 2 state troopers marched up the metal stairs, grabbed Jeremiah by his tailored arms, and roughly spun him around. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting closed around his wrists sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. Big Joe Higgins, watching from the cab of his parked rig across the yard, laid on his deafening air horn for 3 solid seconds. It was a loud, booming cheer of absolute victory from the working class. As the troopers marched a weeping, handcuffed Jeremiah Lee down the stairs and toward the back of a police cruiser, Leonardo Young turned away from the pathetic display. He walked directly toward me, descending the steps with a calm, measured grace. "Brenda," Leonardo said, his harsh demeanor softening instantly as he approached me. He extended his hand, and I shook it firmly. "I apologize for the chaos of this morning. You handled this situation with exactly the kind of precision and uncompromising safety standards I require for my materials." "I was just doing my job, Mr. Young," I replied, glancing at the flashing federal lights. "Or, at least, the job I used to have." Leonardo smiled, a genuine, shark-like grin. "That's exactly what I want to talk to you about. Let's get out of this impound lot. We have a very lucrative contract to discuss."